The gravel came at dawn, and it came like a verdict. 3 dump trucks, nosing up the lane in the gray light, their beds tilting and the crushed limestone pouring down in a gray flood across the only road that reached the Hallery place. Marta Hallery stood at the top of her porch steps in her night clothes and a man's canvas coat, and she watched them bury the lane her grandfather had cut through the hardwood 60 years before, and she did not scream, and she did not run down the steps waving her arms the way the men in the yellow vests plainly expected her to. She only stood, and she counted. 11 truckloads by the time the sun cleared the ridge. A foreman with a clipboard leaning against a white pickup, not even watching her. Because a woman alone on a played-out hill farm was not something the Ardennes Consortium had ever needed to watch. And here is the thing worth telling first, before we go back and earn it. Because the ending of this story was written long before that morning. Written in the yellowed ink of a document folded into a Bible on a shelf in that farmhouse, a document nobody had read in 40 years. The land remembers what the ledger forgets, an old man would tell her once, and it only whispers, so you had best learn to be quiet enough to hear. On that gray morning, Marta was quiet. She was quiet all the way through what came after. Quiet while a $500 million project ground toward her door. Quiet while the whole county laughed. And when at last she spoke, in a crowded meeting hall with every powerful man in the valley leaning forward to hear her surrender, what she said turned the whole thing over, like a spade turns sod. But we are ahead of ourselves. Go back. Go back 4 seasons. To the spring she came. She came in April with everything she owned in a hatchback and a checkbook that held $41,000, which was the sum total of a divorce settlement, a sold-off condominium, and 11 years of a marriage she did not talk about. She was 43 years old. She had never farmed. She had grown up 200 miles east in a mill town, had spent her working life as a records clerk in a county assessor's office, which is a detail I ask you to hold on to because it will matter more than anything else in this story, though neither she nor anyone else knew it yet. What she knew was that her mother's father, a man named Owen Delcourt, had left her the last thing anybody wanted. 160 acres of steep, stony, cut-over hill ground in the far corner of Cotter County, with a sagging house, a collapsed barn, a spring that ran thin in August, and a title so tangled with old easements and heirs' claims that 3 lawyers had told her it was more trouble than it was worth. She paid the back taxes anyway. $9,400 in arrears, and the county was glad to be rid of it. That left her $31,600 and a hill and a name people in town could not place. The realtor who handed her the keys did not bother to hide his opinion. He was a florid man named Beck, who sold mostly hunting parcels to men from the city, and he told her, standing in the ruined yard with his hands on his hips, that she would be gone by first frost. Nothing grows up here but rock and regret, he said, and he laughed at his own line because he had used it before. The nearest neighbor was a mile off. The town of Cotter's Landing was 11 miles down a road that turned to washboard gravel after the second bridge. There was no cell signal on the hill. There was a wood stove, a hand pump that worked if you primed it, and a view down the hollow that on a clear evening could stop your breath, though a view does not pay taxes. Beck drove off in a cloud of dust, and Marta stood in the yard with her $41,000 already down to $31,600, and she did the arithmetic that would become the drumbeat of that first year. So much for seed, so much for a used tractor. She could not really afford. So much for the propane and the county fee and the part for the pump. Subtract, 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 and at the bottom of the column, a number that got smaller every week and never once got larger. That was the arithmetic of the hill, and it ran against her from the first day. She had a plan, or the shape of one. She had read that the steep ground of that county, useless for row crops, had once grown apples. Not the shining supermarket apples, but the old hard cider and keeping varieties. The crooked, knotty trees that could root in shale and send a taproot down 30 feet for water no plow could reach. Owen Delcourt had planted an orchard on the south slope in the 1950s, and by the time Marta arrived, it was a wreck of a place. 40-odd trees gone feral, choked in wild grape and cedar, most of them she assumed long dead. The men in town, when they heard what she meant to do, thought it was the funniest thing they had come across in years. An apple orchard on the Delcourt rocks. A woman alone, no less, who did not know a pruning saw from a rip saw, meaning to bring back trees that had not borne a marketable fruit since Eisenhower. They said, "A woman alone up there," and they said it the way you'd say a fool and her money, and it followed her around the feed store and the diner like a burr caught in wool. Marta heard it. She heard most of it. She said nothing, because she had learned in 11 years of a bad marriage that a thing you do not answer cannot be turned back on you, and because, if she was honest in the dark of that first month, she was half afraid they were right. But there was already that first spring, a shadow moving behind the ridge that none of them saw, not the men at the diner, and not Marta, because the Delcourt Hill did not sit alone. It sat at the head of the Kettle Hollow watershed. And the Kettle Hollow watershed, it turned out, sat on top of one of the largest untouched deposits of high-purity silica sand in 3 states, the fine white glass-making sand that a certain kind of factory will pay any price for. And a firm called the Ardennes Consortium had spent 2 quiet years buying up hollow ground under shell companies and grinning options, assembling parcel by parcel a $500 million sand mine and processing works that would swallow the whole watershed and ship it out on a rail spur they meant to build. They had nearly all of it. Nearly. There was one hole in the map, one parcel the mine could not go around, because the only legal road access to the entire east half of their holdings ran up through it, up an old cut called Delcourt Lane. And Marta Hallery, records clerk, divorced, 43, alone, had just paid $9,400 in back taxes to become the sole obstacle standing between a consortium and $500 million. She did not know that. Had? Not for a long time. She only knew she had trees to save. The man came in, May. He drove a car too clean for that road, and he wore a soft gray jacket and shoes that were ruined the moment he stepped into the yard, and he smiled at her with a warmth that she would later understand was a tool he carried the way another man carries a wrench. His name was Ross Vandell, and he said he represented some regional development interests, and that they were putting together a conservation and recreation project down in the hollow, and that as a courtesy, and because they hated to see good people struggle on hard ground, they were prepared to buy her out. He named a figure, $52,000. It was more than she had paid, and he watched her face for the gratitude he was sure was coming. He told her it was a generous offer for a place that, frankly, and he said this kindly, wasn't ever going to be anything but a burden to a woman on her own. Marta stood with her calloused hands, already calloused after 6 weeks, folded in front of her, and she looked past him down the hollow at the fog burning off the trees, and she said, "No, thank you. I believe I'll keep it." That was all. Vandell's smile did not move, but something behind it did. He left a card on the porch rail. He said the offer wouldn't stand forever, and he said it lightly, but it was not a light thing. And some animal part of her marked it the way you mark a snake in the woodpile before you know quite what kind it is. Then she was alone again with the trees, and the real work began, and it nearly broke her. She spent June and July on that south slope with a machete and a bow saw and a chainsaw. She was frightened of cutting cedar and grapevine off the old apple trees, dragging brush into piles until her hands cracked and bled through the gloves. Of the 43 trees she uncovered, she counted 19 that showed any green at all, and of those 19, only 11 that looked as though they might have a season or 2 left in them. 11 trees. She sat down on a rock in the July heat and did the arithmetic, and it was ruinous. Even a healthy mature apple tree might give 5 or 6 bushels. 11 half-dead trees. If she was lucky, if a late frost didn't take the bloom, if the drought the county was already whispering about didn't burn the fruit, might give her, what? 30 bushels and hard cider apples sold to nobody at all because there was no cannery, no press, no market within 100 miles. Subtract, subtract. She had $8,200 left and a hole where a plan had been. She put her face in her split and dirty hands, and she came as close to leaving as she ever came. And then she heard, from the tangle at the top of the slope, a sound she had not heard on the hill all summer. It was a low, steady hum, a great living murmur, and she got up and climbed toward it, and there in the hollow of a dead oak, at the orchard's edge, was a wild honey-bee colony, thousands of them working the last of the wild raspberry, and every one of them, when they had done with the raspberry, would turn to her apple bloom next spring. And something in that sound, that patient, indifferent industry, put a hand on her shoulder and told her to stay one more season. She stayed. That was the first small sign, and she did not yet know it was a sign of everything. The old man came in August, walking, though he lived 4 miles off. An old man in a straw hat with a stick, and he stood at the bottom of her lane a long while before he came up, the way courteous country people did before they knew you. His name was Emile French, and he had come to that county from somewhere far to the east half a lifetime before, and he spoke a soft, careful English with the vowels of another country still in it, and the men in town both respected him and gave him a wide berth, for he had a way of knowing things about weather and ground that unsettled them. He did not laugh at her orchard. He walked the rows slowly, touching the bark, tasting a leaf, standing under the one tree that had against all odds set a scattering of small hard green apples, and he was quiet for so long that Marta grew nervous. Then he said, "These are not sick trees." He said, "These are old trees, and old is not the same as sick. No more for a tree than for a man." He told her the trees were not dying, they were starving, choked and shaded for 40 years, and now that she had let the light back to them, they would remember what they were for. He said a thing then that she would carry the rest of her life. He said, "The land remembers what the ledger forgets, and it only whispers, so you must be quiet enough to hear it." Then he did something practical, which is the mark of true wisdom over the false kind. He knelt and dug his fingers into the dirt at the drip line of a tree, and he named it, gave her the old country name, and told her these were not cider trees at all. Somewhere in the tangle, old Owen Delcourt had planted a handful of a russet-keeping apple, a homely brown-skinned late apple that stored till spring and grew sweeter for the storing, the kind of apple that had gone out of fashion so completely that men had forgotten it was the finest eating apple ever grown. "There is no market for these," Emile said, "because men have forgotten them." He smiled. "But the tongue remembers what the market forgets too." That autumn, the first autumn, gave her almost nothing, as he'd warned. 11 trees, a scattering of fruit, 4 bushels of hard little russets that she stored in the cool of the stone cellar under the house, because Emil told her to, and she had learned to do what Emil told her. And it was that winter, the long dark winter of her first year, that the second figure in this story entered it. Though he entered so quietly, she nearly missed him. There was a family a mile and a half down the road, the Sisks. A hard-luck family. The father gone somewhere, the mother working 2 jobs in Cotter's Landing, and the youngest of them was a boy of 10, named Dell, who had taken to walking up the ridge because there was nothing at his own house but a cold stove and an empty afternoon. He started appearing at the edge of her yard, watching her split wood, saying nothing, a thin, watchful boy in a coat too big for him. She gave him a russet apple from the cellar one gray day, just handed it to him without a word, and he ate it, standing there, and his eyes went wide, and he said, "That's the best apple I ever had," and it was the first time in that whole long year anyone had told her she was right about anything. He came back. He came back most days. By spring he was helping her, and he had named the trees, all 11, given them names out of his own private mythology, and the tree that bore the russets, the mother tree. The oldest and gnarliest he called the grandmother, and the name stuck, and it is worth remembering that name, the grandmother, because it was the grandmother tree that saved them all. The second spring the bees came to the bloom as she had known they would, and the 11 trees, remembering what they were for, set fruit as they had not set in 40 years. And Marta pruned and thinned and prayed against the frost, and slowly, over that summer, a thing began to happen on the Delcourt Hill that no one down in the valley could see, and that she herself kept quiet as a coal banked low under ash, because here was the second half of Emil's gift. He had told her that first August that the drought everyone feared was coming, and coming worse than the old-timers had words for, and that when it came it would ruin the valley. But it would not ruin her. Why not? She had asked. Wiv. And Emil had pointed his stick down into the shale at the base of the grandmother tree and said, because these old trees do not drink from the sky like the corn does. They drink from below. He told her that the russet stock Owen Delcourt had planted was grafted onto a wild rootstock that drove its roots down through the fractured shale to a deep seam of water that no drought could reach, water that the whole ridge sat upon an aquifer. The old man had known about the way country people know things, without a survey, and that, as long as those roots held that seam, her trees would bear in a dry year that killed everything green for 50 miles. She had listened. She had not fully believed, but she had done what he said, and now, watching the valley below turn from green to gold, to a sick, pale brown, as that second summer burned on without rain, she began to believe. The drought came down on Cotter County that year, like the open door of a furnace. The creeks went to string, then to stone. The corn in the bottoms curled, and rattled, and died standing. The cattlemen sold off their herds at a loss because there was no hay and no water. And the diner in Cotter's Landing grew quiet and grim, and the men who had laughed at the woman with the dead orchard were not laughing at much of anything anymore. And up on the Delcourt Hill, in defiance of everything, the 11 old trees hung heavy and green, their taproots pulling cool water out of the deep shale. And by late that second summer they were setting the finest crop of russet apples anyone in that country had seen in living memory, if anyone in that country had come up to see it, which no one did. Because who climbs a mile of hill to look at a fool's dead orchard? No one but the boy, Dell and Emil, and a stranger. The stranger came in September driving up the washboard road, because he'd heard from a produce broker 2 counties over a rumor of an old woman growing an apple. Nobody grew any more. He was a chef, or a buyer for chefs, a lean, impatient man from the city with a knife in his pocket, and he cut into one of Marta's russets, standing in the orchard, and he went still, the way Emil had gone, still the way the boy had gone still, and he said, "My God." And then he said a number. He offered her $4 a pound for every russet she could grow, delivered fresh and stored more than triple what a good eating apple brought, because he said there was nothing like it left in the world, and the restaurants in the city would fight over them. $4 a pound. Marta went home that night and did the arithmetic, and for the first time since April of the year before, the column did not run against her. It ran the other way. 11 trees, $4 a pound, and the arithmetic of the hill, which had subtracted from her for a year and a half, had at last, quietly, begun to add. She told no one. That was the discipline Emil had taught her, to bank the coal low under the ash, and not let the wind of other men's opinions get to it. She sold that autumn's crop to the city chef, and she paid off the last of what she owed, and she put money by. And she was careful and plain, and no one in Cotter's Landing knew she had done anything but survive another season on the rocks. But you cannot bank a coal forever without the smoke of it rising, and by the third spring the smell of what was happening on the Delcourt Hill had reached the one man in the county who was paid to know such things. Because Ross Vandel and the Ardennes Consortium had been watching that whole time. Watching and waiting for the drought to break her the way it had broken everyone else, so they could buy her lane cheap and finish their map and begin their mine. Only she had not broken. And the drought, which was in its second brutal year now, was doing something to the consortium's plans that none of their engineers had foreseen. Their entire $500 million operation, the mine and the washing plant and the processing works, depended on water, enormous quantities of water, to wash and sort the silica sand. And the creeks that were to feed it had gone dry, and the shallow wells they had drilled came up dusty. And the project that had swallowed a whole watershed was choking to death. Of thirst on top of an ocean of sand, they needed water. They needed a great deal of it, and they needed it in one place, and their own surveys, the same surveys they'd waved around to condemn the land, told them exactly where the water was. It was under the ridge, at the head of the hollow. It was under the Delcourt Hill. It was the same deep shale seam that fed the roots of 11 old apple trees, and it was, though they gnashed their teeth at it, the property, road, and mineral and water rights, and all of a woman alone, whom they had once offered $52,000 to go away. Vandel came back up the hill in the third summer, and the warmth was still in his voice, but it was thinner now, stretched over something harder. He did not talk about conservation and recreation anymore. He talked about the future of the county, about jobs, about progress, and he offered her not $52,000, but $180,000 for the parcel. And when she said no, thank you, I believe I'll keep it, in the same plain words as before, his voice changed for just a moment, and he said, "You don't seem to understand what's about to happen here." And then he made the mistake that men like Vandel always make, which is that in his frustration, he let slip how much he knew. He said, "We know you've got water under that hill, 400 feet of head, in a fractured shale aquifer, with a recharge rate we've already modeled, and we mean to have it." And Marta, standing on her porch, filed that away, that too precise figure, 400 feet of head, because it told her that they had been surveying her land, without her leave, and it told her something else, that whatever they wanted was worth so much to them that they had spent real money to measure it in secret. When Vandel left that day, he did not leave a card. He left a threat, wrapped in courtesy that the county could always find a use for a road, that eminent domain was an ugly word but a legal one, and that a woman alone might find the machinery of progress hard to stand against. The 3 tightening waves came after that, just as Emile, watching from under his straw hat, had said they would. First, the rumors, which flowed down off the ridge and into Cotter's Landing, that the woman on the Delcourt place was hoarding water in a time of drought, that she had a spring running full while her neighbor's cattle died, that she was selling fancy apples to the city for $4 a pound and would not share a drop with her own suffering county. The rumors were half true and wholly poisoned, and they turned some of the sympathy she'd never asked for into resentment. Second, the paper. A notice arrived, certified mail, that the Cotter County Commission would hold a hearing on a proposed public road improvement and right-of-way action affecting the Delcourt parcel, which was the polite legal name for taking her lane, and with it, control of the ridge. And third, on a gray dawn in the third year, exactly as this story began, came the gravel. 11 truckloads of it dumped across her lane in the pre-dawn dark, burying the road her grandfather had cut on the pretense of a maintenance survey, a naked act of intimidation meant to show her that they could reach her, that they could bury her in, that the machinery had already begun to move. She stood on her porch in a man's canvas coat, and she counted the trucks, and she said nothing. And when they had gone, she walked down and stood on the gray flood of crushed stone that covered her lane. And she was frightened, more frightened than she had been the whole 2 years, because she understood at last the size of the thing that had turned to face her. She went to Emile. She found the old man in his own small tidy garden, coaxing beans out of the drought, and she told him everything, the offers and the surveys and the 400 feet of head and the hearing and the gravel, and she said, "I don't know how to fight this. I'm one person. and Emil straightened up slowly and looked at her a long time. Then he said the thing that turned the whole story on its axis. He said, "You are asking how to fight them with what you do not have. Money, lawyers, men." He tapped his temple. "Ask instead what you have that they do not." And Marta stood in the bean rows and thought about it. And then, because she had once for 11 years been a records clerk in a county assessor's office, because she knew, as those men in their gray jackets did not, that the truth of who owns what and who may cross whose land is not decided by dump trucks or by consortiums, but by paper, by old paper, tithe lied and forgotten in courthouse basements and folded into family Bibles. She went home and she took her grandfather's Bible down off the shelf. It was the only thing of Owen Delcourt's she had kept, and she had never much looked inside it. And folded into the back of it, brittle and brown, was a document, and she sat at her kitchen table by lamplight, and she read it, and her clerk's eyes, trained for 11 years to read exactly such things, understood in about 90 seconds what 3 lawyers had missed because they had never actually bothered to read it. She sat very still. Then she got up and drove to Cotter's Landing before the courthouse closed and paid $2 to have a certified copy made of the original recorded instrument, and she took it, along with the Bible copy, to the one honest lawyer in that county, a tired old man named Pruitt, who had done Emil's papers for him years before, and she laid it on his desk. And tea. And Pruitt read it, and then he took off his glasses and looked at her and said, "Well, I'll be damned. Do they know about this?" And Marta said, "No, I don't believe they do." And Pruitt smiled, for the first time in a long professional life. He said, "Then let them find out at the hearing." The humbled beggar came the week before the hearing. He came in the person of Wade Coley, who owned the biggest cattle operation in the valley, and who 2 years before had been the loudest man at the diner, the one who'd started the joke about the woman and the dead orchard, a big, florid, confident man, much like the realtor Beck. And he came up the hill because the drought had all but ruined him, and because he had heard, everyone had heard, that the Delcourt place had water. He did not swagger. He stood in her yard, turning his hat in his hands, and he told her that his cattle were dying, that he had 200 head with nothing to drink, that he had said things about her he was ashamed of, and that he would pay her whatever she asked, for the right to water his stock at her spring. And here was the first of the 2 moral choices this story had been building toward, quiet and enormous. Marta could have named a ruinous price. She could have made Wade Coley pay for every joke, every burr of laughter that had stuck to her at the feed store. She looked at the big broken man turning his hat, and she thought of Emil's words about the land remembering. And she said, "You don't pay me anything, Wade. You bring your cattle up the back trace where the trucks can't block it, and you water them, and you tell your neighbors they can do the same." And Coley stared at her, and something came loose in his weathered face, and he said, "Why? Why would you?" And Marta said, "Because the water was never mine to sell. It came up out of the ground before either of us was born, and it'll be here after." Then she said the thing that mattered. She said, "But I'll ask you one favor. Come to the hearing Thursday. Bring your neighbors. Come and sit down and listen." And Wade Coley, who had 200 thirsty cattle and a debt of shame he did not know how to pay, said, "I'll be there, and I'll bring the whole valley." The hearing was held in the old Grange Hall in Cotter's Landing because the courthouse room was too small. And the whole county came because the whole county had heard something was going to happen, and the drought had made men hungry for anything at all to happen. It was 101 degrees in the shade that Thursday, and the Grange Hall was an oven-packed shoulder to shoulder. And up at the front, behind a folding table, sat the 3 county commissioners and the county attorney. And beside them, uninvited, but present in the way such men are always present, sat Ross Vandell in a fresh gray jacket, with 2 lawyers of his own and a stack of engineering surveys, ready to secure the public road improvement that would hand a consortium the ridge. The county attorney opened it. He droned through the legal necessity, the public benefit, the great mine project that would bring jobs to a suffering county. 400 jobs, he said, and $500 million of investment. And all that stood in the way of this deliverance was a single stubborn landowner who would not accept a fair and generous offer for a marginal parcel of no productive value. He said it looking straight at Marta, sitting alone in the front row, with a manila folder in her lap, and the boy Dell beside her, and old Emile behind her. And Vandel, invited to speak, rose and turned on his warmth for the whole crowded room, and he painted the future, the water pipe down to the great washing plant, the sand shipped out on the new rail spur, and he said, with a sorrowful shake of his head, that he wished it did not have to come to a compulsory taking, that the consortium had offered this landowner far more than the property was worth, and that he hoped even now she would see reason. Then the chairman asked if the landowner wished to be heard, expecting, as Vandel expected, as the whole room expected, a broken woman's plea, or a broken woman's tears. And Marta Hallery stood up. She was not a large woman, and her voice was not loud, but the Grange Hall went so quiet in the heat that they heard her at the back. She said, "I'll be brief, because I don't have much to say, and most of it's in this folder." She said, "First, I want everyone here to know that any man in this valley whose stock is dying of thirst can water them at my spring, free starting today, and that Wade Holy's been doing it since Monday." And Wade stood up in the middle of the crowd, red-faced, and said, "That's the God's truth. She never charged me a cent." And a murmur went to the hall, like wind through wheat. Then Marta turned to Vandel, and she said, "Second, I want to ask Mr. Vandel a question. You told me on my porch that there's 400 feet of head under my ridge in a fractured shale aquifer. How did you come to know that?" And Vandelcott started to say something about public survey data, and Marta laid a paper on the table. "That well," she said, "the test well your people drilled, it's on my land. I never gave anyone leave to drill it. That's a trespass, and it's on record with the state now, because I filed the complaint Monday." The county attorney's face changed, and then Marta opened the manila folder and took out the certified copy of the document from her grandfather's Bible, and she said, "But none of that even matters. Because of this. This is a deed of easement and covenant that my grandfather Owen Delcourt recorded in this very courthouse in 1958, 60 years ago, when he sold the mineral and surface rights to the whole rest of Kettle Hollow to the man the consortium bought them from. And in it, my grandfather kept back two things for this parcel forever. He kept back the water rights to the aquifer under this ridge, in perpetuity, for the benefit of this land and this land only. And he kept back the road. Delcourt Lane isn't a public road, and it never was, and the county can't improve it or take it, because it's a private easement that runs to this parcel alone. And every other parcel in the hollow was sold subject to it, meaning they can cross it to reach their land, but they cannot own it, or control it, or bury it in gravel. She let that sit, she said, quietly, into the roaring silence. "So there is no water for your mine, because the water is deeded to these trees. And there is no road for your mine, because the road is deeded to me. My grandfather did that 60 years ago, and I only had to read it." Pruitt, the old lawyer, rose in the back and said, in a dry courtroom voice, "I've reviewed the recorded instrument, and I'll be filing to quiet title and to enjoin any road action on Monday, and I'll win. Because the paper's plain, and it's been sitting in this courthouse the whole time. Any of you could have read it. Nobody did. You could feel the room turn. It turned the way a great weight turns, slowly and then all at once. The three commissioners looked at the county attorney, and the county attorney looked at Vandel's surveys, and Vandel looked for the first time like a man standing on a floor that has gone out from under him. And the crowd, the whole hot-packed Grange Hall, full of ruined farmers and thirsty cattlemen, and the men who had laughed at the diner, understood in one moment that the woman alone upon the Delcourt rocks had been sitting for 2 years on the only water in a drowning county, and had just given it away free to all of them, and stopped a $500 million mine, cold with a sheet of 60-year-old paper. Wade Coley started clapping. Then another man, then a dozen, Then the whole hall stood, and men who had never spoken a kind word about her took off their hats, and the boy Dell was grinning up at her with his whole thin face, and Emil sat with his straw hat on his knee and his old eyes bright. Vendel gathered his surveys with hands that were not quite steady, and he leaned in close to Marta as the noise rose, and he said low, "Only for her. This isn't over. We have lawyers." And Marta looked at him without any anger at all and said, "I know you do. But the paper is older than your money, and the land remembers." And Vandel walked out of that Grange Hall and out of that county, and the Ardennes Consortium quietly folded its options within the year and sold the hollow ground off in pieces to the very farmers it had meant to swallow, because a mine that has no water and no road is not a $500 million project, it is a hole in the ground. It turned out was its own kind of reply. The rains came that fall, the drought at last breaking in 3 days of soft, steady weather that soaked down into the cracked ground, and the creeks came back, and the corn the next year stood green. And up on the Delcourt Hill the 11 old trees, the grandmother tree in their midst, bore heavier than ever, and the boy Dell, who was 12 now, and no longer a stranger in her yard but nearly a son, helped her graft 20 new russet trees off the old stock, so that the orchard her grandfather planted would go on. She was no longer the fool on the rocks. She was a fixture, a name people said with respect, the woman who'd stopped the mine and watered the valley, though she never once told it that way herself. Wade Coley plowed her a proper new lane with his own tractor, digging the consortium's gravel back out of the cut Owen Delcourt had made, and would not take a dime for it. And Emil came up the hill one bright, cool morning near the end of that 4th season, walking with his stick, and he stood with her under the grandmother tree, while the bees she'd first heard 3 summers before worked the last of the year's bloom, and he ate a russet apple slowly, with his old teeth, and he was quiet a long while in that way of his. Then he said, "You asked me once how a woman alone could fight them." He gestured with the apple core at the deep-rooted trees, at the ridge, at the valley below them, healing green. He said, "But you were never alone. The land was under you the whole time. It remembered what the ledger forgot, and it only whispered." He smiled at her, the smile of a man handing back something that was always hers. "You were just quiet enough," he said, "to hear it." And Marta Hallery stood on the hill she had bought, for the price of its back taxes, among the trees no one had wanted, above the water no one had known she held, and she understood that she had come to the far corner of Cotter County, a stranger, with $41,000 and a name nobody could place, and that she had, without ever once raising her voice, become the one thing she had never in 11 bad years believed she could be, which was a woman who belonged exactly where she stood.
Ça fait ah oui, ça faisait 1 an quand même, à Chiesa? Ah oui, c'était une grande, grande pause du coup. Heu, je sais pas pourquoi ça fait ça. Je suis en train de me battre avec TikTok, hein, comme d'habitude les amis. On va retourner là, c'était plus joli. Et bonsoir monsieur Sige, bonsoir, bonsoir. Ah coucou Greg, comment tu vas? Coucou Jean-Marc, comment ça va? J'attends un peu, j'ai quelque chose à vous montrer, je commence à avoir chaud, je vais pas pouvoir attendre 150 ans. Je pense que de toute façon Jenny va pas venir ce soir parce qu'elle bosse, mais je vais vous montrer.